Over the past 60 years, South Korea has been one of the world's greatest economic success stories. After a brutal war in the 1950s, it pulled itself out of extreme poverty and built one of the most advanced economies on the planet. But now all of that is at risk. South Korea is becoming the incredible vanishing country. It has the world's lowest birth rate. In 2022, South Korea's birth rate fell to 0.78 children per woman. In Seoul, the country's largest city, home to 1 in 5 South Koreans, the birth rate is just 0.59. That's just slightly more than 1 child for every 4 women. South Koreans just aren't having kids. Forecasts show the country's population could fall by 30% over the next 50 years, from the current 52 million to 36 million. And by the end of the century, if nothing changes, South Korea's population will shrink to just 15 million. It's estimated that within 100 years, more than 95% of South Korea's towns and cities could disappear. So what is going on in South Korea? Why has the country stopped having children? What does this mean for its future? And what is the country doing to change course? In this video, we'll answer these questions, but before we get into it, be sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news and analysis on global economics. And if you like this video, hit the like button to help us spread the word. The Korean War lasted from 1950 to 1952, and it was one of the most brutal conflicts of the post-World War II era. Some 5 million people died, half of them civilians. And when the war was over, both communist North and pro-Western South were among the poorest countries in the world. But in the decades to come, the fates of North Korea and South Korea would diverge. While North Korea remained mired in a brutal Stalinist dictatorship, South Korea built a modern economy and became one of the world's wealthiest countries. It wasn't easy. South Korea is at the south end of a peninsula, and it's cut off from the rest of Asia by North Korea. Essentially, South Korea is an island, and this island has almost no natural resources and a mountainous terrain that means very little of its land can be used for agriculture. So the only way for South Korea to succeed economically is to trade. The country imports food, fertilizer, and 95% of its energy. What's more, the country doesn't have any true friends in the neighborhood. Today it trades with China, but China is allied with North Korea and has been North Korea's protector for decades. Without China, it is unlikely that North Korea's dictatorship, with its endless threats of war against South Korea, would even exist. Officially, Japan is an ally and a trading partner, but the Japanese and South Koreans don't like each other. That might have something to do with Japan's annexation of Korea in 1910 and the 35 years of brutal tyranny suffered by the Koreans at the hands of the Japanese. So South Korea's only true ally is the United States, and its ability to survive as a country depends on the continuing support of the US and the US's ability to maintain open seas in East Asia. Without access to the sea, South Korea wouldn't be able to import the energy and food that it needs. The country would literally starve and freeze to death. In the 1950s, as South Korea rebuilt from the war, it was one of the poorest countries in the world. Then in 1961, it underwent a military coup led by General Park Chung-hee. Park saw the predicament that South Korea was in, and he began a series of reforms to turn the country into a trading giant. Starting in the 1960s, South Korea began subsidizing giant corporations known as chaebol, a word that comes from the Korean words for wealth and clan. These wealthy clans became the giant South Korean corporations we know today: Samsung, LG, Hyundai. These are conglomerates that work in everything from manufacturing to shipping to retail and telecommunications. The point of building up these giant conglomerates was to have businesses large enough to compete in the global economy. Initially, through these conglomerates, South Korea imported raw materials and exported finished goods like steel and chemicals. This economic model essentially copied Japan, which is in a similar situation as South Korea. An isolated island with no natural resources, Japan has to buy all its raw materials and energy from abroad. Like Japan, South Korea invested heavily into educating its population. As the people's skills grew, so did the sophistication of the products it exported. South Korea hit a major milestone in the 1980s when it began exporting its first mass-produced car, the Hyundai Pony. For the first time, consumers in Europe and North America were buying a major consumer item made in South Korea. In the decades to come, consumers all over the world would be buying TVs and air conditioners made by LG, and smartphones and refrigerators made by Samsung. South Korea built itself into an export behemoth. And today, we can add cultural exports too. K-pop groups like BTS and TV shows like Squid Game have become a multi-billion-dollar export for South Korea. It's hard to understate what an enormous success story this this is. They call it the miracle on the Han River. In the space of a few generations, South Korea went from being at the bottom of the economic ladder to being the 10th largest economy on Earth. At the beginning of its economic reforms in 1962, the country's per capita GDP was just $104. It had half the per capita income of South Africa and 1/3 that of Mexico. By 1989, as Americans and Europeans were driving around in Hyundai Ponies, its per capita GDP had grown to $5,500. And today, its per capita GDP is $35,000 annually, making South Koreans, on average, among the richest people in the world. At the end of the Korean War in 1952, South Koreans and North Koreans were roughly equally poor. Today, the average South Korean is 30 times as rich as the average North Korean. But that average masks huge differences among South Koreans. The giant chaebol that dominate the South Korean economy have resulted in extreme economic inequality. The country's giant corporations produce 80% of its products, but they employ only 10% of the population. Just one of these companies, Samsung, accounts for 20% of the country's exports and 17% of its total economic output. Want to start a small business? Good luck. If you build anything even remotely original or innovative, you can expect one of the chaebol to steal your idea and run you out of business. Want to complain about it to the government? Forget it. The government has long been in the pockets of the giant conglomerates. After 60 years of success, the unintended consequences of South Korea's economic model are beginning to make themselves felt. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the collapse of South Korea's birth rate. The lack of babies being born means South Korea's population is now shrinking, with more deaths than births every year. And the pace of population decline is accelerating. In 2020, South Korea's population fell by 32,000. In 2021, it fell by 57,000. And in 2022, it fell by 124,000. Of course, South Korea isn't the only country in the world where the birth rate has fallen below the rate of replacement. The same thing has happened in Japan, Europe, and North America. But South Korea has it worse than any other country in the world, and there are many explanations as to why. Many blame the country's work culture, which is as intense as it gets. In recent decades, it's been common for South Korean office workers to spend 12 hours a day at the office and then spend the evening drinking and eating with coworkers, an obligatory activity unless you want to lose your job. With that kind of work schedule, who has time to raise kids? Others point to the country's soaring costs of living. The cost of housing, as a share of income, is the 11th highest in the world. And it's not just cost, it's crowding too. The mountainous terrain of South Korea means its population had to squeeze together in extremely dense cities in order to build a modern economy. Many people simply can't afford an apartment large enough to raise kids. Education is expensive. If you want your child to succeed, you'll need to send them to private after-school cram schools, which cost thousands of dollars per year. The country's intensely competitive school and work environments have led to the rise of a group of people known as the hikikomori, young people who have dropped out of society altogether, who live at home with their parents and practically never leave their homes. The term hikikomori, like so many other social problems in South Korea, was imported from Japan. None of this is lost on the government, which sees financial disaster on the horizon. As the country's population ages, a shrinking number of young people will have to work to support a growing number of seniors. To address the problem, South Korea has spent $212 billion over the past 15 years to support child-raising families. The main part of that spending went towards cash payments to the mothers of newly born babies and to a monthly child allowance. Parents receive around $1,500 for the birth of a child, then around $500 per month per child until the age of 1. After that, the parents receive $250 per month per child to the age of 2. South Korea is also paying $500 a month to the hikikomori crowd in an effort to get them to leave the house and, who knows, maybe start a family. But so far, it hasn't worked. South Korea's birth rate has kept falling even with the child allowance in place. The government plans to increase the payments in 2024 to around $750 per month for a child under 1 and $350 per month for a child under 2. It remains to be seen whether the new, more generous payments will have any impact. Other, more aggressive policies proposed by the government haven't worked out either. The country is facing a labor shortage caused by a lack of young workers. In order to address the problem, in early 2023, the government proposed increasing the maximum work week, including overtime, from 52 hours to 69 hours. But that move was quickly met with a backlash from South Korea's youth, who took to the streets in protest. Critics of the proposal said it would backfire. They argued that working longer hours might fix the labor shortage in the short term, but it would mean even fewer children born in the long term. Amid the protests and criticisms, the government was forced to back down. But South Korea is also trying something that isn't common in East Asia: immigration. Since 2004, the country has been accepting low-skilled foreign workers. Originally, these were meant to be temporary residents who would eventually go home, but the government has made policy increasingly liberal, allowing more and more of these migrants to stay permanently. In 1990, there were just 49,000 foreign nationals in South Korea. By 2019, that number had swelled to 2.5 million, accounting for nearly 5% of the country's population. Most of these migrants are Chinese nationals of Korean origin, along with Vietnamese and Thai citizens. Today, 1 in 10 marriages that take place in South Korea involve a foreign citizen, likely because marriage to a South Korean is one way to gain citizenship. But in East Asia, where xenophobia runs deep and the history of war between nations is not forgotten, it's an open question whether immigration will be able to solve South Korea's demographic crisis. Will South Korea become East Asia's first multicultural society? The odds are against it today, but as the country's demographic crisis grows, it might be the one solution available. In the meantime, get ready to see a lot less of this in South Korea, and a lot more of this. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and help us spread the word about our channel. Check out one of these videos here to learn more about the economic problems unfolding around the world. And don't forget to subscribe to get notifications about our latest news and analysis. Thanks for watching.